Well, so we know Thomas Sayre's a good sculptor because that's why he's here, right? But you probably don't know that he's married to a woman named Jed. I found out today that stands for Joe Ellen Deck, right? Is that where Jed comes from? I just learned that. He was also a Moorhead Scholar at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, if there's any other place you have Moorhead Scholars. He majored in English and studio art. And one of the interesting things I learned about you at some point, and I don't remember exactly when, but he was going to graduate school and decided to quit. And he started building playgrounds, is that right? Got interested in doing things that were in service to the community and saw playgrounds and making playgrounds as a way to get there. He and Steve Schuster started Clearscapes in 1980, and they've been partners ever since. Let's see, he used to tour as a professional musician, and I've heard rather regularly that he is into rock and roll. More seriously, he was recently awarded the North Carolina Award for Fine Arts, and I hear he's going to graduate and get his honorary doctorate from NC State this coming spring, right?
Can you imagine?
How about that? Tell us the story, Thomas. Whenever you're ready.
Tell us a story, okay.
Yeah, tell us a story.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to try to make this... Because I played way too much rock and roll, I can't hear very well. So I'm hoping for those of us that have been suffering in the back, can you hear okay? Yeah. And if you can't, hold up your hand. I'll know what you need. So I did indeed major in English. And as you saw earlier in that wonderful clip, I'm a preacher's kid, and there's several other PKs in here. And so words were around me. And when I received the various titles, it's morphed a lot, this symposium. And now there are 4 words. Well, they're not here, but it was art and science, and then it was art and science and design, and that was kind of the last time I heard saw the marquee. So my whole talk's based on that, and then how about technology and the humanities? We'll slip those in too, so I'm not going to address those 2 things because it's too late. Clicker. I took the subject pretty seriously, and I'm going to inflict upon you some of my background as an English major, and we're going to dissect a poem. So here's where, as you know, I was raised up. The house is right there. And what I learned and was aware of at a very early age is how a cathedral goes together. I knew that these limestone blocks, when you stack them up, had to have these little steel pins between them. And it wasn't the mortar that held everything together, it was the pins, although in the recent earthquake those pins are not enough. You have to have a continuous rod, we now know, and there's a lot of tragedy to that. So I was aware as I walked through the eastern rose window right there, as a 17-year-old, I actually walked through the scaffolding, which now is 90 feet in the air with stained glass. I was very aware of the craft, of the engineering, the science involved in making structures. I was equally aware of the fact that this place, as light traverses through it, often colored light, and as sound wafted through it, that this place was and is capable of conveying deep human emotion and meaning. And I knew both of those things, a lot about how it goes together as a structure and what it does. I knew those things at age 6 or 7. So when I first heard the subject, I heard, oh, science and art. And how many times have you heard, oh, I'm left brain, I'm right brain, and we, oh, heart and mind, and this dialectic. And we just say, we sort of acknowledge these things as not really opposites, but sort of opposites, and we move on. And we don't think about, very often, what is the relationship? And I think it is in that relationship that I will try to make the case that place, responding to place begs the question of, so what is a place? And we've heard hints and guesses about it today. But I'm going to try to press that point a little bit. Because what's missing in this typical kind of, a lot of liberals talk about Myers-Briggs, and I'm an ITNJ, and that's sort of who I am, and you move on. There's no discussion about that. Similarly, there's very little discussion about what connects these things. And in our brain, what connects them is the corpus callosum, the pipe that connects the two lobes of the brain. And therein, in my view, is the third leg of the stool, which is critical and often not talked much about. The third leg being what might be called design. And interesting, you talked about architecture not being an art, and I winced at that. I thought, oh, of course architecture is an art, but architecture might be in here, which is a combination of these two things. So in some ways, you can think of design as being the corpus callosum, the mediating pipe between these two things. The corpus callosum is a neurological thing. Everybody gets that, right? Okay. I may not have elucidated that enough. So when we're willing to see this thing as a three-legged stool, I think it moves from being a place to a space, and that's what I want to talk about, is that word. And then responding to it is a much easier matter. So I made this slide from a poem which I encountered when I was about 20 years old by Wallace Stevens. And I'm going to inflict it upon you twice. And you're going to have to bear with me because I think, so this poem by one of the great American poets, written in 1919, is full and replete of ambiguity. And because it's so ambiguous, it's a very difficult poem, but it really nails the difficulty of defining place. It's not that long, thankfully. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made that slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wildness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere, but the jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee. So let me read it again, and so those of us that are visual will appreciate that here it is visually. So I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was on the hill, and it made that slovenly wilderness. And that's a tricky word, slovenly. If you go back and really look at it, it really means unkempt, which isn't a bad thing, in my view. I like unkempt things. Obviously, that's one of the real tricky moments of this poem. Is that slovenly like seedy and nasty, or is it just unkempt? It made that slovenly wilderness surround it, and the wilderness rises up to this man-made thing called a jar. The jar was round upon the ground, we already know that from that line up there, and tall and of a port in air, kind of stately, but it's just a pissant jar. It took, now what the it is interesting. Is that the jar? I think so, but a lot of people argue that. It took dominion everywhere. It somehow presided, that little measly jar, over that beautiful view. But the jar itself is gray and bare. It is just a measly jar. So how can it have the power to make the wilderness surround it and be so commanding of the wilderness? And the jar did not give of bird or bush. These things live in the slovenly wilderness. The jar is like nothing else in Tennessee. So my view is that what this poem is really about is that Wallace Stevens looks at this great view, this space, and his view comes down for a moment and sees this bit of man-madeness, human artifice. And his view goes back up to the wilderness, and it's changed somehow by this bit of man-madeness, which in itself is no big deal. It's just a jar. And I would posit to you, and I'm going to show you 3 examples, one quite overt, of the act of putting a jar in space and how that jar makes place. So the jar, this is just a metaphor, it's not really about the jar. It's about us, it's about human energy. I was talking in that film, which made me weep, about it's just a hole in the ground that we dug in Oregon. And yet, it is a very important hole for those of us that dug it, and those of us that put that energy, that science, that craft into that hole. So, I'll try to make this clear with 3 examples. And by the way, I'm not going to talk for an hour, I don't think. If somebody has a burning thing to say, by all means say it. I've actually seen these slides before, although it is a new slideshow. This isn't an old. So here's project number 1. We actually saw it earlier today. And the project start. A lot of you have asked about earth castings, and you're going to see how this goes. Apologies to some of my friends from ECU. You might have seen a few of these before. So I was interested in a tall structure, kind of a port in the air, that I could get inside and look up, and I was interested in that. And so, I went back months later and I thought, that one looks kind of interesting as a drawing, or this one, or that one. These are very different ideas. And so then I made a model, which is about this tall, in concrete, that's very thin. And it seemed to continue to have promise. And then I found a place and an opportunity to make this piece as tall as it needed to be to act like the jar in this 30-acre field. It's not big to be macho. It's big to be big enough to create place in this space. So, in order to make a 30-foot high, 40,000-pound thing stick out of the ground, especially when the wind blows, there is a lot of engineering, and I would quickly posit that engineering to me is applied science. It's science that sort of finds its way into the real world to do useful things. Not that science isn't by itself, but it's sort of applied science. So all these little lines here you'll see later, they are rebar, as in steel, which makes concrete, which has great compressive strength. It gives it tensile or what's the word, Mr. Engineer? Cantilever. It allows it to be a tension structure on one side away from where the wind is blowing. Notice that these splotches here, that is mud, because this drawing was actually on the hood of the truck. It's real, this stuff. It's not just a drawing that gets filed away. We actually have to do this. Put the steel in there so it really works, so that when the wind really does blow in the big hurricane, it doesn't break off this cantilevered arm. So we start with, here's the artist's drawing right here. Spray paint. There are 2 panels, as you saw in the drawing. Well, it does have 2. One of the drawings had 3. And we start digging in the ground. And we dig with backhoes and shovels and feet and whatever it takes to create the shape we're looking for. And eventually, once the shape is right, so this is a big mold. Here comes the steel. They looked like little black lines before. Now they're galvanized rebar that are hand bent with legs and feet to make them conform the steel to the irregularities of the dirt. So we dig as precise a mold as we can, but picture playing in the backyard in the mud. It's not a very precise medium. The medium of dirt, the earth, pushes back, and it's not something one can impose pristine geometry into. And go back to the jar and how pristine that was in the slovenly wilderness. So the artifice of the jar and the slovenly wilderness are getting really close together right there. And so here's the other leaf. They're kind of leaf-shaped. These wonderful collaborators that I get to work with are working hard. Once we open up a hole in the ground, we don't want it to rain on it, or at least not much. So we have to go very fast, and that means 12, 14-hour days until we're done. I talked about wrestling with the angel. It feels like that. This is where it ultimately goes on a sub-footing. It's stood up, and then we pour around that. You'll see that in a minute. So when the time comes, we contract with a concrete company excuse me, that brings us our special mix, our own personal mix, and we put color in it to tint it to be like the color of the ground, of the earth. And then, in this case, sometimes we pour it and trowel it by hand. Other times we do this, which is a shotcrete machine. So this is like a swimming pool. In fact, these are swimming pool contractors. Their comment was, so we're going to make a swimming pool, and then we're going to pull it out of the ground. Is that kind of the deal? And I allowed as, yes, it was the deal. And they thought that was pretty interesting. So here we are shooting concrete. It's small aggregate, but it comes out at high speed, and it's quite dangerous. There's rocks banging around all over the place. It's a big old day to do that. And then we trowel it out and notice the earth and the concrete are very similar in color. And really, concrete is, gravel, sand, and cement. It's all out of the earth anyway. And then we let it cure for about 28 days. And then we dig it out like a cake in a cake pan. So the backhoe has done its thing, and my friend Daniel is sort of doing some of the last trimming to get it as light as possible so it has a chance of coming out of the ground. Nancy, when did we start?
Oh, I think it was right at 4.
Okay, just checking. So here is the piece dug out as much as we can, and we're hooked onto it with these big shackles that are all rated for a certain amount of pull-out capacity. So this weighs 40,000 pounds. You add all these up, I think we had like 50,000 pounds of capacity for pull. So 50,000 spread between these 4. So we're now ready for the crane, the very expensive 195 ton crane, to come into our site. And oops, we forgot to tell you that there's this big squishy part right in the, and so this crane that weighs about 200,000 pounds is now mired up to the axle. Within the first 10 minutes, there's a crowd watching.
Of course.
It's not good. So he's calling his boss on his cell phone. I'm calling the very expensive wrecker truck. So 3 hours later, voila. And this guy is so strong he can just pull this crane right out, which he did. And so then, now 6 hours later, up comes another semi-truck. This is the third semi-truck on the premise, who has this oak road. These big, very heavy things that we put down, and the crane drives and then puts some more down and drives some more. So now, as the sun isn't quite setting, we're now hooked up to the crane. It was an expensive day. And the crane is putting 50,000 pounds of pull. So picture doing a curl, veins popping out in your neck, and nothing is happening. So Do you get the vibe? So we're consulting here what to do, and the answer is, oh, the key is still in the backhoe. And we drive the backhoe out, and we do what in the field is called a little ooch, a little with the backhoe, while we have the 50,000 pounds of curl going on. And what we're looking for is a crack to form between the earth and the piece. We want that to happen, because that means it's starting to turn loose. And hallelujah, the crack comes, and up, up, up goes the piece. And we then bring it down into the footing that you saw earlier, and we brace it off temporarily. And the other one, this is now 2 days later, and voila, it looks a lot like the model. But we're not done. We've just begun. Because it's not about rendering this times 40,000 pounds times 2. We had to do all that engineering. Remember, engineering is allied with science. It's only when Jed and I came to visit and the sun was raking on it, as it does every day, and the procession of seasons, which changes that light. And when you can see through that jagged fractal edge, which is the concrete getting so thin that it breaks off until it's strong enough as it comes out, and that's what defines that line. So that's the interface right there, of the jar and the slovenly wilderness. And on a sort of a different scale, this is where a piece of rebar in somebody's pocket scored the mold. It was a depression in the mold and becomes a protrusion in the casting. So it's, and up here is little shovel marks. And there's a foot mark somewhere over here. So the surface raked by the wonderful sun shows in a different way where human intention, human control, all that we are so proud of, meets the grain of nature, meets what nature put in that soil starting eons ago, the color, the rocks, all that stuff, sometimes human fragments we find. 3 feet down at the Museum of Art, 3 feet down in what was farmland, now the museum, on the edge of the mold, you know, down here, here's the surface, I saw a little glint, and I scruffed it out, and it was a silver spoon. How did that get there? Down a post hole or something? I have no idea. So the point is that this surface is an expression of that balance between space, the slovenly wilderness, lots of words, and what we intend and strive as people. And I think at that point of intersection, art and science in many ways meet. And alas, the port in air, which is what I really wanted to see just the sky with this wonderful surface surrounding. And my friends, the filmmakers, Donna and Georgianne, got that, that swirling around thing was better than a still. So a couple of examples of this kind of work. And what I didn't show you is the big 20-acre field, beautiful field with that piece in it. And it's very much like a jar in Tennessee. Here's another one that I think functions the same way, Geyer in the North Carolina Museum of Art. This is a jar, called jar, in northern Massachusetts, or a piece called Nest, 3 examples. This actually is a bird and bug house. You can fly as a bug inside, and there's places for nesting, various kinds of nests for birds. It was interesting who really showed up and who got driven out by. So it wasn't as bucolic as it sounded. We're providing a little house for everybody. Well, there's battles over this house. Project number 2, and I would posit that this is responding to place, is a very different kind of place to begin with, and the goals and raison d'etre of this project was very different from what you just saw. This is Chattanooga, Tennessee, which was the Pittsburgh of the South, and like Pittsburgh, around after World War II, things started to turn sour. It was heavy industry, and they fell on very hard times, polluted and broke. In the late 70s, early 80s, there's some real leadership in this little sleepy southern town, and they said, why don't we build an aquarium in the middle of the country? Gee, that's a good idea. But it was a good idea. And that helped transform their riverfront, which was completely polluted and full of defunct industry. And civilization, the right kind, urban design, marched east. And about up here is the convention center and the Chattanoogan, which is a sort of sister convention center. And just beyond that, so here's the Chattanooga, not a very good photograph. Just to the south, 1,000 feet to the south, is Main Street, which was this thriving street, mercantile street. Then it became the African American street, which was thriving and great. And then it went down. And this is a particularly snowy day with a derelict building. And mostly private money. Main Street has come back in the last 10 years in really wonderful ways. And you can see it everywhere, including mixed race residential, which is pretty extraordinary for that town. However, the 1,000 feet separating the two was rather blighted. So there's the Chattanoogan up there and the convention center here, and light industrial. And here the city discovered, oh, we own this little former railroad siding, and here's Main Street. And so the good stuff of Main Street is right about here going that way. Brownsfield and a huge water, stormwater problem. All the water goes to there. So they said, they made another good urban design decision. They said, we want to make that the avenue to connect, from the river to there, and then now to this really cool Main Street hipster spot. So there it is, so that's looking north towards the Chattanoogan, and this is looking south towards Main Street. I mean, it was a wreck. Polluted. I mean, it was not a place you'd want in your high heels, being a conventioneer, go to all the hip breweries and restaurants to the south. You just wouldn't do it, and people didn't. So the goals were for the town, we want to do art. I'm not sure why they thought that, but they did. We want to do, there's a lot, part of the retooling of Chattanooga was to be a sort of mountain climbing, kayaking, outdoorsy place. And there's a lot of that, and right around this area there are 3 fitness places, including CrossFit, which are, you see them all over the place, these legions of people working really hard, and that was right there, and they wanted to provide for that. They also wanted to provide for the millions of gallons of stormwater that was landing in this space. So we were the lucky winners of a competition, and what we proposed was to make a bridge, and that's all about the zeitgeist of this town. This is Walnut Street Bridge, which is now a pedestrian bridge from 1890s. Great truss, handmade riveted truss work. Yeah, there we go. It's beautiful stuff. Okay, I'm trying to be patient. So we designed, I won't bore you with all this, these 3 bridges that spin around on 20-foot pylons that look like the pylons of the real bridge, that form, that connect the 2 So do I need to aim this or what? Okay, maybe that's it. So here's the 1,000 feet of the little strip of land, and here are the bridges in the middle, and then there are these pylons that have lights, and so there's a visual connection that spans the 1,000 feet that we thought was important. So you saw where you're going. We then designed this water retention area, and there's a recycling, and the town has proclaimed it's saved, I've forgotten the numbers, but it's thousands of dollars in not having this water go into their sewage treatment plant. So it's kept there, and it was, but the other thing was, it's long and skinny. I said, well, it's like a track, like I used to run around at St. Albans School. And so we made a track out of that, and the cross fitness guys wanted, so they could time so their little 1/10 of a mile or yards, 50-yard markers. And we made the markers, we commissioned these haiku poems, which was kind of fun, to be the markers. So as you run, you can contemplate the 4 seasons. Hannah, you'll like that one, right? No, those are the 4 elements, sorry. So here's the before, and ta-da, here's the after. So this is urban leadership, at its best, to have the guts to, let an artist lead the idea for this place with great landscape architects and water people, like Nancy. And so here's the bridge, so the public can turn these cranks and make the bridge align and be a bridge, or it's sort of, school is out, they're just all over the place. So every time you go there, and these are 26 feet long and they're 20 feet in the air, they're big and heavy. And so, but a kid can move them from below. And so the evidence of people and how you last left it, they don't move in the wind, they're too heavy, is I really like that the public can sort of re-sculpt the space of this place. So I would say that this project is including the element of place that involves people. Out at Liza Olander's farm, there's people, but it's primarily the art and the procession of seasons and the sun, and those kinds of, it's sort of me and God. Whereas here, this is a very serious people space. And so the place and responding to place has everything to do with these people. Not just these people, but lots of different kinds of people. There's little turnouts for this kind of exercise. This is one of the lines of one of the haikus. So these are just terrazzo strips that are actually accurately measured for 50 yards between them. And at night, these are these really great lights like you see on top of water towers and stuff. They're really bright lights that vividly connect the 1,000 feet. No matter where the pieces are left, you get the idea. And here's the water retention, which was very elaborate and pretty interesting to watch being built. So, a very different response to, or creation of place as a response to a very different place. And here's a couple of other examples that I would put in this sort of realm. This is Anschutz Medical Center, University of Colorado, where the mission was to span this former road, now spine of the campus, with a series of stations bookended by these 16-foot diameter spheres, the high tech of this stainless steel, high tech medicine as high tech science, and medicine as the healing art on the dirt floor of a third world clinic, both of which they teach here. And then in between are these little sort of outdoor rooms that have lights, have internet booster, have power. And so because of those amenities, the students really do hang out there. The chancellor of the medical school, during the selection process, did allow he shared with me afterwards that he didn't really like this percent for art thing, that he thought was a horrible waste of money. State money, and he could use it better as chancellor for more defensible things than art. And he said, and by the way, Thomas, since I can't stop you, you're going to do this gig anyway, you damn well better be ready by graduation. And I said, I'll be ready. And so at graduation, there was a line, cap and gown, the parents, everybody lining up to take the shot where you see all the way through these voids, you know, at the ball at the end. And he had the I thought, humility to actually write me and said, it's a good thing. It's become an icon for our campus, and I appreciate it, and I was wrong, which I thought was very, that's a lot for a chancellor. So you students out there, don't be dismayed. You know, there's good and there's bad. Okay. And another project in Calgary, Canada. This is the water center, where in the ground floor you pay your water bill, but the upper floors are all about water stewardship, which is it's a big deal here, but it's arguably an even bigger deal on a prairie. And so this project was about harvesting all that water. It came off this roof and doing various things with it, and then marking with these vessels that are, you know, all about our. I mean, a vessel was created to contain water, and that's a different kind of jar, and it sort of looks like a jar. This isn't quite finished yet, but anyway. Or Nashville, Tennessee, right in front of the courthouse. This piece, which are two glass figures that also rotate, and at night become the glitzy Nashville scene, called Citizen, which I won't bore you with the whole story, but there's a lot of very important citizen acts have happened for 100 years, well, actually 200 years, including the two North Carolinians that flowed down the river and climbed up the bank and said, this looks like a good place, and started Nashville. So Nashville started by North Carolina. So here are the two North Carolina, I think of them as the two North Carolinians, which was a big deal when these were erected right after their flood, their really devastating flood, where they didn't request federal funds. They did it themselves. They recovered themselves, and they were very proud of that. And so having these two figures, which you can spin, and so they point, and you can make them point at the mayor's office, or the city council, or the business community. And it's one of those lucky things. It arrived right at the right time, where it became this celebrated thing for them, because the flood had sort of opened them to this possibility in a weird kind of way. And my favorite, so this is Green Day playing, you know, combining my two great interests, rock and roll and sculpture. Okay, last story, a shorter story, I think. So now we're in Phuket, Thailand, looking west as the sun sets across the Andaman Sea. And this is actually a swimming pool with a zero edge. And so it's quite the place to have a little glass of wine as the sun is going down. And I was there, and later Jed and I both were there, to work on a project up north in Chiang Mai. But we were summoned to meet way south, because this is a much better place to kind of recover from the long plane ride, don't you think? And we were there to meet this individual whose name is Tri Devakul, who is Thai and who I happen to have sort of grown up with. He lived in the deanery for 18 years. He's 10 years older. And he, who's an architect and then developer, was really the first to go to Phuket and owned a bunch of land and built the first big hotel, the Club Med, and many others, including his own house. And so if we had swum, if my camera had panned over here, you can look down into the cove. And down in that cove was this not very good sort of motel kind of thing. And Tree was looking down there, and he started on this little soliloquy about regret, that he as a developer had started the ball rolling in Phuket, which is now, you know, an enormous resort. A lot of Europeans, many go there, Americans, everybody, China, Japanese. And down in this otherwise pristine cove was this motel. You know, think Motel 6, the Thai version of that. And at that, and he was saying, you know, what have I done? And at that moment, a butterfly landed on his hand. And with tears in his eyes, he said, what have I done to the butterflies? And then we were both silent for a long time. And so the next morning, I think it was, he said, I want you, before you work on the Chiang Mai project, to work on a project here. And it wanted to be a beacon for the boats on the Andaman Sea, but also for the one little road. It's the very end of Phuket. But really, it was a big house for bugs. And in the tropics, bugs, if there's a void, bugs go into that void. And it turned out one of his restaurants has the largest red wine collection in all of Thailand. So we ended up making this pagoda, which is really a bug house. The bug house part, coming from 4,000 wine bottles that were cast in these rammed earth molds. So it's kind of like an earth casting, but not quite. And they sent an architect over from Thailand to learn how we were doing these, and then went back and they got really good at it and innovative about it, and could mass produce these blocks and up. These are wonderful Burmese people from Myanmar. And so they were tasked with building this hotel right next door, small boutique hotel. But they were also building this. And so here it is, 55 feet tall, and all these little dots are wine bottles. So inside, it's this amazing bunch of little bug houses. And the bugs, sure enough, they move in quick. And they get along better than birds in Virginia. The birdhouse, the bugs seem to get along better. And it lights up at night with this stainless steel thing that you can see through. Well, I guess you just did, yeah. What I learned from this, so these guys, these wonderful laborers who are very skilled, when Jed and I came back to kind of look at the finished, but it wasn't finished, there was still welding on the top, and the welder got hurt, and so I said, well, I can weld this, and I started up the bamboo scaffolding, and they really didn't want me to do that. And after a while, I got the impression that they thought I was some sort of special guy, because they figured out that I had something to do with this. And they had reverence for this structure. They knew that it wasn't about the hotel. I don't know if they got the bug thing or not, but they knew this wasn't some sort of development money-making thing. This was for the doing. And I realized then, soon thereafter, something about what I've heard liberal Episcopalians sometimes talking about, which is this Celtic word or phrase called the thin place. which is where it's said that heaven and the earth kind of get closer together, and the border between the two gets thin. And I realized for these guys, and for me to some extent, Jed can speak for herself, that this became a thin place. And so I offer this to you as another kind of making place, responding to place. When we do our jobs really well, with a lot of luck, sometimes we can even get to a thin place. And so here's a couple of examples since that project that I've come to think of as thin places, and I now look for them. And so in Kyoto, Japan, outside of Kyoto, I found these kind of structures that are very familiar, often as rural, as the jar gets assumed by the slovenly wilderness. There's a point of balance, more balanced than the photograph I made of the jar in Tennessee. There's a more of a commingling of these two forces, and I find that to be a very thin place. I find the stand of bamboo outside of Xiamen, China, to have been a very thin place. Or the standing stones, but not the obvious ones. Stonehenge I find to be thicker than this, which is a lone stone that aimed at another stone somewhere. Or I'm not sure which direction. It's just there, but it's clearly been set there. And that was a very thin place for me. Or, surprisingly, the Clifford Still Museum just opened 2 years ago in Denver. A wonderful building, poured in place concrete, with this fabulous collection of only Clifford Still's work, most of which has not been seen and been hidden in his basement for years, until the right town came along and said, we'll build a museum just for his collection. And I found some of the vistas in this building with the daylight coming through this wonderful kind of waffle concrete work, and then the paintings beyond. I found this to be a thin place. Or this grill at the one of the palaces, I don't know which one, in Beijing. The way the light came and illuminated this lacquery surface, and the shape. It says something about it. Or in Kyoto, the Philosopher's Walk, so-called, and I realized that the makers of this knew that eventually this person with the red coat would come and be seen, and it would become, at that moment, a thin place. Place has something to do with who you're with, both thin places and not so thin places. So remember who you're with. And lastly, I leave you with this slide. When I was here in July, I think it was a surprisingly not too hot July day, and the wind was blowing under the building. And we walked around and around and saw the sun go down. And what was the building, and what was kind of like where the concrete meets the land, the dirt. This slide right here, I think, to me, epitomizes the success of this place. And I had whiffs of thinness that day, that night. So I'm going to conclude with that, and would love to have conversation if you're up for that. This isn't a big question-asking crowd, I noticed. So thank you. I hope that this has has actually said some things that might be useful about place and responding to it. That was my intent. Yes. Is that a question?
We spoke earlier about permanence.
Permanence.
Permanence. In your work, I noticed that especially like the rebar is allowed to touch dirt, or I realize that the rebar is allowed to essentially touch dirt or be close to the surface. Is that not correct?
No. He must be an engineer. Are you an engineer or a builder? So the question is, the rebar is allowed to touch the dirt. And what that means is, so rebar is steel, and it will rust. And so who's seen the underside of a bridge, and the rusty rebar is breaking the concrete? So when rust happens to steel, it gets bigger, cracks the concrete, and it's not too many decades before that bridge will be in the drink. That's the issue. We do not let the rebar touch the dirt. We don't have much coverage, but we have ANSI standard, which are bridge, the guys that govern bridge. So we conform to all that for good reason. And we galvanize the rebar at great cost and pain in the assness. Excuse me, did I say that? So I'm aware of the issue, and it's a struggle because we want the concrete to be thin. So this is the engineering part, right? Art and engineering, science. I want the rebar to be right in the middle of the concrete. I want the concrete as thin as possible because otherwise the weight gets to be too much. Question?
So why galvanize instead of using epoxy rebar? Why galvanize?
Wow, this is some rebar. There's another builder back there. So epoxy rebar is steel, which is coated with usually green epoxy, probably seen that along highways, as opposed to shiny silver zinc. I much prefer the shiny silver zinc visually. And I can get it dunked in North Carolina. So all that rebar is lowered into a 60-foot long vat of 850-degree molten zinc. It's like a Hieronymus Bosch painting. It's like, and all this sparks and stuff come. It's pretty cool. I much prefer that than stinky old epoxy. Yes?
Have you ever, I can't recall when you were at EC last, if you said you ever left one of your earth castings in the earth, like you couldn't retrieve it, and what impression did that leave upon you? So,
Is the question, have I ever left one in the dirt?
yeah, like you couldn't extract it.
No, eventually I get them out. Sometimes more money and pain than others. And you get better at it. I have lifted one up and it broke right there. And I thought I had to make a decision real fast. I just thought the cheapest thing to do now is put it right back down and cover it up and make it again. So that has happened, but I've always gotten them out. Yes?
Many of the art students have to work alone right now, and over the course of time, many artists collaborate. And I'm curious, the course of collaborating with all these people, the engineers, is that pain in the ass, or is that like an approach to thinness for you? Or can you talk a little bit about the difference between working alone and that pleasure and working with groups?
Great question, and coming from you, you have your own answer. I like working alone. I mean, the classic 19th century artist in the grotto, slaving away. I like doing that. I often do it at night. And I make things that don't take casts of thousands, and I don't need helpers, and I make art designed that way so that it is just me. I learned fairly early on that I probably would go nuts if that's all I did. Wrestling with one's own angels and one's own little world gets sometimes boring and sometimes scary. And so I have always sought collaboration. And I've sought spaces / places to encounter because I wanted to be in the real world. I made playgrounds for severely and profoundly retarded individuals because it was something to push against. It wasn't my own demons. And so it was content for me coming from them. So I do both, and I do both pretty hard. I like collaborating, and I do it a lot Clearscapes was formed as a collaboration between an architect and an artist. Now there's 22 or so, and there's all these different spirits and these wonderful guys I work with. You know, the collaboration with the crane guy. You know, you saw me sitting there, and he said, well, "Why don't you just get that backhoe and ooch that thing a little bit?" And he was dead on. Ooch it a little bit, and sure enough. I mean, that was a serious collaboration. I mean, the meter ticking, the crane, all the guys, the concrete, I mean, is real expensive. And, you know, we need to get that thing out of there. Ooch did it. Yes, sir.
I love this idea of the thin place,
Mm-hmm.
and your efforts to actually create those. Although you didn't necessarily point to a lot of your own works as doing that, but as I saw that those huge jars coming up, particularly that one in the 20-acre field coming up,
Mm-hmm.
I thought, what would I feel like if I was in a golfing Indian or an Indian of any kind coming across that, you know, in the wilderness, and there was nothing else around, just that, you know, and it would become a holy place almost immediately. It would be. One would step inside of it and feel very different about that particular spot and what it meant. And so I was thinking about that. In other words, maybe we should rename this entire event today, you know, Art, Science, and Spirit.
Well, talk to Nancy about it. You could glom on another name. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about percentage for art and how many cities have instituted that for their new buildings?
Percentage for art. So everybody know how that works. It's capital construction defined somehow, and a percentage of some pot of money has to be used for art. You know, that's what the chancellor of the medical school was kicking about. There are about 300 programs in this country that are, so the state of Colorado has its own, the city of Denver has its own. In North Carolina, there are 4 towns that have percent for arts programs. Raleigh being the newest for 3.5 years only. So it's tricky business. The places where it works really well, it works well because they've been doing it for a long time, like Seattle, like Portland, like Broward County, Florida, 20, 30 years. And they get really good at it, and the community gets good at it and starts to expect it and don't get all uptight about it when something happens that some people don't immediately just love. And they're willing, they've developed a patience to know that sometimes good art takes a while to kind of graft to a community. We were lucky in Nashville because the flood happened and the name and everything about that piece just sort of happened. And people went, yeah. It doesn't always happen that way. I've been threatened. If you come around this town again, or else, literally, from people who just are that upset about money for art. Other questions? Yes?
Do you have a favorite installation, and if so, why? And if not, why not?
Well, wait a minute. If I don't answer, I have one, then why not? Is that what you just said?
Is it you love them all? Or, you know,
Well, I learned from them all. There's no question some are more successful than others. There's luck involved, like in Nashville. But I would say my favorite pieces are where there's a real issue, where there's, you know, a lot of percent for art. I mean, there's a lot of bad percent for art projects that have happened. And one of the reasons that is because, for instance, a project I did where at a prison in Oregon, medium security, $50 million prison, and who's going to see the work? It's not inside, it's outside. Oh, the wives and children who are going to come visit on Sunday afternoon, oh, they're going to be able to play on it. No, they can't get near it. So the whole premise was kind of, and then interesting, but I needed the bread, so I said, sure, I'll do it. And then it got up, and it's kind of a pretty cool piece, but they then didn't have funding to operate the $50 million prison So it has remained empty for 8 years. And great art out front. So I find that most dissatisfying. There's a project called the Healing Place in Raleigh that is a it's a residential facility for street addicts, alcohol and drugs. And it was real clear what the content of that place was about. And my job was to respond to that. And we built this really great kind of park with an earth cast door. So you come out of the door into the courtyard, and this big thing is in your face. And if you meander around it and encounter the 12 steps, encounter the community gathering outdoor space, third premise of their second of their, and the reflecting pool of the higher power. Those are the 3 tenets of what they do, and those things are in the park. And at the end is this open door of opportunity. And that was my best shot, okay, and we did it, and within a year, so there's this movement from the more restrictive wing to the less restrictive, and then you're out on your own. And the men who live there now have a procession when they graduate from one to the other, and they go through and go around the door of blockage and through the door. I saw that and wept. So that's one of my favorites. Stuff. Yes.
I noticed most of your art, and even the one you described, has a. So
Sorry,
I've noticed that most of your art, and even the one you just described, has an element of habitation where you can touch it, be on top of it, be inside of it, and look up, or bugs maybe can inhabit it. I wonder if you could just talk about if that's a conscious decision or where that comes from.
Well, I don't know if I'd want to live in any of them. If I was a bug, maybe, but so I'm not making buildings, but some of them have the scale of buildings. Being able to get inside, to look up and see the port in the air, that's a dimension of that those that drive by it on Mount Olive Church Road don't get unless you enter it. So it's just another dimension for me. And they're big enough so that you can do that if you want to. Geyer at the North Carolina Museum of Art, the bike path goes between them. You can interact with them in a lot of different ways. And so rather than just a visual thing, that's one thing that sculpture can do, is you can get on it if it's big enough and tough enough, or get under it, or drive through it. The big piece that you saw the molds for, so Geyer is 18 feet tall, and the piece in Portland that we saw the mold of is 30 feet tall. So it's almost twice what Geyer is. And the reason for that is because there's 2 highways, 8 lanes, and so they got to be big enough to be seen. There's a flyover road, there's heavy rail over here, and then the light rail train goes right through them. And so they need to be that big to hold up in that very tough environment. There's so much transportation stuff, and they need to be hefty enough. It's not to dominate. The jar really doesn't, especially in the slide I made, the jar does not dominate the slovenly wilderness, even if you think it's slovenly. The wilderness will win in Tennessee, anyway. So it's not to be big. I remember when I was in art school, it was make it big and paint it red. It was all this metal bender swagger. Does that ring any bells out there? Or are we over all that? Other questions?
What's your
Yes.
practice about going back to check on your work? Or you just leave it, or if anything is
What's the practice of
not permanent?
when it's done?
Maintenance or anything going on that you don't approve of, or do you have spies to go back?
Okay, so how would we capsulize that question? What happens after they're done?
Yes, do you go back and revisit and see if conditions are the way you want them?
I don't have much say over that, and conditions often aren't. The mowing doesn't happen, or the weed eating is rather rough, and weed eat against the piece, but I know that's coming, and I make them robust enough conceptually and structurally and visually that they can take the clutter of life, which happens. I've had to pitch a fit a couple of times. Not that that did any good, but some places maintain pieces really well and some don't. Some places, well, so when you make public work, you put it out there, and you know, the skateboarders get on it or they don't. But it's life, so you know, as opposed to a museum, I'm well aware of the fact that I don't make museum work and have guards and a roof. I have to survive in the real world, and museums are arguably not the real world. And I prefer that. Yes?
I have a question about the monument or the steeple that you made in Thailand.
Yes.
There,
Do you mind?
I know in Thailand there's a tradition of building, whenever they build a structure, they build a little house for the spirits that lived in that space, so that they won't make trouble in the house, that you have to make a little space for those
The fee
spirits.
house. Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if Tree brought that concept to you when you were building it, or if you saw those spirit houses, because it strikes me that what you created there looks like a very beautiful spirit house in a way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, those are called fee houses. And so you want well, they're not bad spirits, but they're kind of rough spirits. And you don't really want them in your house. It's kind of like older sons. You want them to live out back. And, well, I mean, the notion of this very successful hardcore developer weeping over the bugs and spending 9 months, among others, building that and paying for it is extraordinary. I mean, he's a Zen guy. I mean, he's a Buddhist, not a Zen guy. He's a Buddhist, and he believes that. And so whether that's a fee house in his mind, I don't know. I never thought about that. We used to have, until it fell apart, we have a little fee house in our garden. So I think it's a great idea, where the rough sons live. Any other comments? You students back there have been pretty quiet. It's okay, no pressure. So Nancy, thank you. This has been a great conversation.